Welcome. There's emptying. People are filing in from the digital waiting room. So we'll give a couple more seconds for that to happen, but I'm glad everyone's here and prompt. All right, I think everyone is in. And as people file in, they'll just join the group. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us at the what is our regular workshop time for our Center for Cultural Affairs, but today's our special edition. It's our virtual book launch for Joanna Woronkowicz's new book, just out, on artists at work, rethinking policy for artistic careers. This book is out thanks to Stanford University Press and is now available at your fine booksellers or .com of preference. And today we're going to have this book launch. We're going to let Joanna just take it away. As questions come up, feel free to type them into the chat. I'm sure she won't go too long, so you can also just wait until the break and then ask the question live and in person. Your choice, but I'll be watching the chat and translating them over or calling on people after Joanna finishes her initial spiel. But thank you, everyone, for joining. Welcome. Take it away.
Great. Thank you, Doug. So happy to see you guys. Thanks for coming today. And just super happy that I can talk about the book. It's a nice experience doing this in the comfort of our own workshop series with a lot of the same people we see come over and over again, but also some new names. So thanks. So like Doug mentioned, the book came out yesterday and super excited about it. It takes a really long time for an academic book to be produced. So I don't remember when this thing started. Sometimes I don't even remember what's in it, to be honest, but hopefully I'll give you a little bit of a highlight today. So I'm going to go about 30 minutes. And like Doug mentioned, you can put comments into the chat throughout, but I will leave about 25 minutes or so after the fact to discuss and hopefully have a really good conversation, which is the point of these things. All right, so I have some slides for today. How does that look, Doug? Good. All right. Okay, so I'm going to start with just introducing the book title, which is Artists at Work, Rethinking Policy for Artistic Careers. And I'm going to give you a little highlight of what the cover looks like. By the way, I was really so happy with the cover. The publisher asked me, you know, what do you like? What are you looking for? And I was like, I'm really minimalist. And so this is what they came back with. And I thought it was super cool. If you can see the A in the pencil and the W in the pencil, that's sort of the neat little quirk of it. And then even cooler, and I don't actually have a book here in my house, but it's at work. The coolest part is the spine. So if you get a hard copy of it, it's actually neat what they did with the spine. So it's available now because it's September 17th, came out yesterday, and already going around and talking about what's inside of it with a lot of different, you know, kind of interested people, but also interested organizations who think about artist policy. So I'm going to just start with defining what I mean by this term artist, which I think is probably the first question that comes to anybody's mind. Obviously, this term means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, can be interpreted in various ways, but I really like this definition from Maureen Cassutt, which is from her book Art Monster. She's an artist. The word artist is a dumpster. You can throw anything inside of it. That's not how I think about the artist in this book, but I think it gives a good perspective of how difficult sometimes this term is to define. So sometimes, depending on sort of what studies you look at, what grant programs, what context it is, the term artist can mean how an individual spends their waking time, maybe engaging in the practice of a particular form of art. At other times, this term can serve as a self-identifier, and it can allow people to associate themselves with specific social groups and maybe even validate their ego for creating artwork. But on a more technical level, the term artist can be defined by actually how someone makes a living, specifically through the creation and sale of art. So the term can also encompass, and this is maybe part of how somebody makes their career, having particular credentials or belonging to a professional group that grants legitimacy to skill sets. But as we know, credentials are not necessarily something that artists adhere to. But that being said, variations of this term can reflect actually different profiles or images of the artist within society. So 3 common archetypes that I've identified here, more in the book, the 3 common archetypes include the first, what we call the starving artist, which is characterized by individuals who dedicate themselves to their art while facing financial struggles. The bohemian artist, they're often striving to meet their living expenses, basic living expenses. We've also heard of the privileged artist. So these are individuals who enjoy the freedom to pursue their artistic practice, maybe due to family wealth or other forms of support, but this grants them the financial privilege to do that. And then we have what we call the working artist, and those are the people who approach their artistic work as a legitimate career choice and then expect to earn a living from their creative endeavors. So the focus of this book is on the working artist. So in this book, I actually explore how artists build and sustain their careers with a focus on the United States in particular, just because that's where I use data and I conduct my research. So here I give you a little outline of the book. I'm not going to go over the whole thing today. I'm going to actually just focus a little bit on the content in chapter 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then the conclusion. And hopefully you'll be intrigued enough to either ask your libraries to purchase the book or purchase the book yourself. But you can see here that the chapters 4, 5, and 6 actually follow a kind of a specific formula, and I'll get to that soon, but you're going to see the formula for what that is when I describe what's in chapter 4. But the overall argument that I make in the book is that there is a world in which artist policy can be effective if it is keenly informed by the work behavior of artists. Okay, so I'm going to try to make that argument, so let me begin. All right, so the profile of the working artist today is characterized by several levels of complexity, each contributing to an understanding of artists' living and working conditions. So these levels perpetuate myths or they reveal truths about the realities artists face. The first level involves what we call public perceptions, and these are gleaned from historical documents, surveys on how people perceive artists and their contributions to society, and maybe even your own personal connections with artists. Public opinions shaped by these factors play a crucial role in defining societal attitudes towards artists. The second level, I say, is based on narratives, and these are found in popular nonfiction and academic works. So if you've ever read any work by Pierre Menger or Richard Florida, you have this idea of what the artist is, but popular nonfiction, William Dereshevich has a book on the death of the artist. So a lot of these non-fictional accounts of artists and what their lives are like contribute to this narrative perspective. These narratives are sometimes also derived from conversations with artists, but they basically contribute to shaping the stories and images of artists that exist in our collective imagination. This talk and this book actually engages what I call the third level, which is focusing mainly on statistical evidence. So by analyzing data, I'm going to provide a more comprehensive and data-driven picture of the working artist in America today. And I argue that this approach allows for a deeper exploration of the realities that artists face, and that can offer us insights that go beyond mere perceptions or stories. And it's going to ultimately provide us a broader, more detailed understanding of the challenges and opportunities within the artistic workforce that inform the intricate nature of designing public policy for these individuals. All right, so moving on. This is the list that I actually use that provides a list of artist occupations in what we call the standard occupational classification system that's given to us through the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And I use this to analyze data on artists throughout the book and then come to conclusions about policy. There are a lot of controversies around using this particular list, and I go into those arguments in that debate in the book, and I am very clear on describing the reason for taking this approach to define artists. I'm not going to go into that here because that could open a whole can of worms, but I'm happy to take questions after the talk. But just know that this is the list I'm going to be using when I use data to analyze artistic work behavior. All right, so what do we know? I'm going to focus on statistics now for a little bit. I'm going to focus primarily on statistics, though, that are collected prior to 2020, because the arts workforce changed significantly as a result of the corona pandemic. So what we know is that in 2019, there were about 2.4 million artists in the US labor force, and that was about 1% of the total workforce. The gender composition of the artistic workforce maybe has a slight skew, but it's generally half and half, with 51% of all artists identifying as male. We don't have any other gender identification right now in the census data, so we only have male and female. But the gender distribution actually varies significantly across different artistic disciplines. So in certain sectors, females dominate the workforce. For example, artists and related workers, these are mainly visual artists, majority female, designers, actors, dancers, and choreographers, and writers and authors actually showed a particularly strong female skew in its workforce. So while the proportion of artists in the workforce has remained relatively stable over time, the absolute value of artists has experienced fluctuations. And I don't think you can see the difference in colors. And I know Doug hates this graphic, so I'm not going to stay on it too long. But what you're supposed to see is the numbers on the left. The raw numbers, are absolute values, are in gray, and the numbers on the right should be in black, and then they go with the line. So if you can't see that, that's a color issue. So notably, the COVID-19 pandemic, which began in 2020, had significant impacts on the artistic workforce, and that affected both the number of artists in the labor force and also the unemployment rate. But here we see that there was this sharp dip, and ultimately the overall trend. So this is again, the book is really focusing on the pre-pandemic, but there could be a whole new book written about post-pandemic, especially in terms of statistics. All right, so this is a table that gives you some demographic and economic characteristics of artists compared to those of non-artists. And I break these down by college degree and no college degree because educational level is the primary influencing factor for many differences we see between artists and non-artist occupations. So for example, as the table shows, and maybe contrary to common perceptions, the income of artists, if defined in the way that I've defined them, is generally not disproportionately lower than that of other workers, especially when you consider education level. So we know that artists are a very highly educated population. About 66% in 2019 had at least a bachelor's degree, and about 19% in the same year held at least a graduate degree. And this is actually a huge notable contrast to the general workforce, which is about 25 to 30% holding at least a bachelor's degree, and about 10% or so holding at least a graduate degree. But you see the differences here between non-artists and non-artists, but you see that, again, educational attainment is really one of the main differences between this workforce and other workforces. So in the book, then I move on to talk about actually how artists have showed up historically in public policy, for example, in immigration policy, copyright policy, and tax policy, because I argue that if we look at history, we can actually learn a lot about how we manage the present. I'm going to skip most of this section for today's talk because it gets rather intense, but I'm going to say that conducting a historical review of how artists have shown up in policy gives us a picture of volatility in the perception of artists. So we alternated in public policy between pejorative views of artists and admiration, ultimately manifesting in different policies around artists. The nature of policy towards artists has shifted basically in response to the prevailing political and economic climate and the level of support or lack thereof extended to artists by government. Policy for artists, though, in the US, what you get from this historical picture is that it has often appeared ad hoc, responsive to the demands of stakeholders, rather than originating from a holistic approach aimed at designing a system aligned with the production and consumption of arts. And I love this quote by Bill Ivey in his book, Arts, Inc., which he describes our cultural policy in the US as a scattershot cultural policy. And I very much see that when doing a historical review of public policy around artists over the last 125 years or so. So in the book, I go on to analyze several areas related to artist careers, and then I link the analysis to policy recommendations based on the unique work behavior of artists. In this talk, I'm going to just do this for artist training and education trajectories, but the formula is basically the same in that each analysis in each chapter is clearly linked to more effective policies for artists. So I make this link to policy recommendations. But I'm going to start with this area of economic influence on artists, which is their training, particularly in higher education, since we know, again, that many artists actually do have higher education degrees. So in general, the path to establishing a career as an artist doesn't actually seem very straightforward. And I'm sure you've thought about this if studying artists or even thinking about being an artist yourself. There's a lot of uncertainty around what it takes to be an artist and whether degrees or degrees in the arts are necessary to having an artistic career. Contrary to what many art schools might have you believe, there are many pathways to becoming an artist. There are the artists who go to art school with the hope that getting an arts degree will help them pursue artistic careers, and then those who are able to do so. I think of a lot of I was a musical theater actor, so I think of a lot of musical theater actors I know who went to the BFA program at Carnegie Mellon and are on Broadway today. So they're able to do that. Then there are those who go to art school with the same intention and for some reason or other leave the artistic workforce. I was also a musical theater actor who went for a BFA, and I know a lot of people who did that. And then some artists get degrees in other fields and still pursue artistic careers. So, and then finally, some artists don't get formal degrees at all and are still successful at sustaining an artistic career. So Jasper Johns, I don't think, went to art school. While there are many pathways, Yoko Ono did not go to art school. So while there are many pathways to building an artistic career, many artists still actually choose formal education. So I mentioned around 66% or so have a college degree, and this is quite high compared to the general workforce. And about 28% have an arts degree, and this is a degree with a major in the arts, but it's unclear until I talk about it a little bit more, how degrees influence career trajectories in the arts. For example, among individuals with arts undergraduate degrees, only 14% work as artists. And actually, there's a great paper by Neil Alper, who's on this call, published on the National Endowment website that looks at the sort of return on educational degrees for artists. If an arts degree were a surefire way to work as an artist, though, then you ask yourself, shouldn't this number be higher? So I'm going to analyze the training and educational trajectories of artists to understand how policy can actually overall support the careers of artists. So maybe we could get that number a little bit higher. I will note that many of my slides don't have citations on them, not that I didn't cite anybody. I have a very, very long list of references in the book, and some people who have read the book already have told me that the references list has actually been the most useful of all for them. So that's great. All right, so let's understand first the financial return of getting a degree as an artist. So the most basic way to measure the financial returns on a formal degree is to just look at post-degree earnings. We can use the data we have to begin to understand the effects of degrees on the earnings of artists. Between 2015 and 2019, artists with non-arts college degrees, so these are degrees without majors in the arts, earned an average of about $63,000 in the United States, and artists with arts college degrees, so these are degrees with majors in the arts, earned about $48,000. So even though the rate of artists with degrees varies extensively by type of artist, so for example, writers and authors are much more likely to have degrees than dancers, it remains consistent that the earnings of artists with non-arts college degrees are on average higher than the earnings of artists with an arts college degree among different types of artists. Recent evidence on the financial return of degrees for artists based on statistical models that control for different factors that we can say in theory also influence an individual's earnings. So these might be demographic characteristics, having a graduate degree, for example, These illustrate that artists with degrees do in fact earn more than artists without degrees. The evidence also shows, though, that artists with arts degrees have a higher return on college degrees. The return on a degree here means comparing how much artists with specific degrees earn compared to artists without these degrees. Artists with arts undergraduate degrees earn around 32% more than artists without these degrees, whereas artists with non-arts college degrees earn around 8% more than artists without these degrees. Remember, a greater return, though, doesn't mean that artists with arts college degrees earn more than artists with non-arts college degrees, only that compared to artists with arts degrees and artists without non-arts college degrees, artists with these types of degrees earn more. Hopefully that's clear. So then you ask the question of, is it worth getting a degree to be an artist? Yes, according to the evidence on the financial returns of degrees for artists, degrees positively affect artists' average incomes. Note, I use the word average because the income distribution is extremely skewed. This shouldn't be surprising, though, since we know that a college degree increases lifetime earnings for most workers. Despite these returns, artists still have relatively low earnings compared to those of other professional workers with degrees, and artists with arts college degrees have lower earnings on average than artists with non-arts college degrees, which is what I said previously. But we also have to then consider the costs, right? So what about the costs of getting a degree? The cost of getting a formal degree to pursue artistic careers can actually be quite substantial, particularly in the form of the financial cost of attending formal education in the arts. Anecdote, my brother went to art school and had $150,000 in student loans after he finished. Wow. So this sticker price is often not counterbalanced by the financial rewards in future artistic careers, as we all know. So while it's true that many people don't go into debt from attending art school programs, some people are able to pay out of pocket, the disparities between people who can and cannot afford to pay for formal degrees persist in the artistic workforce. And we know that, and the book really goes into a lot about student debt, which has been written on about artists. Richard Paulson, for example, has a great paper on student debt for artists in the Journal of Cultural Economics. We know that artists, for example, take a little bit of a longer time paying back degrees than people in other occupations. But anyway, we know that disparities between people who can and cannot afford to pay for formal degrees persist, and this results in a scenario where many artists come from families with the means to support them. I also talk about occupational persistence for artists in the book. I won't get into it here, but we generally know that whatever degree you go into actually does improve the occupational persistence of going into a particular occupation. And that's actually true for most types of occupations across the board. All right. So the main focus of policy then concerning artists and higher education is on the higher education itself, I argue in the book. Higher education acts as a primary gatekeeper for artistic careers, particularly given the lack of formal accreditation in many artistic fields. For many artists, college is the first place where they seriously consider art as a viable career choice. Given that artists generally have high education levels, attending college is a common path for those aspiring to be artists. There are various policies then and programs within higher education institutions, or HEIs, that can help prevent the accumulation of student debt among artists and arts majors, which is a problem. These strategies include: 1, setting limits on individual debt levels based on the chosen major, may be implemented by the loan provider or the HEI, offering more scholarships, both need-based and merit-based, obviously, but also maybe increasing the selectivity of student admissions into arts programs. So I'm sure some of you are like, wow, these are really Darwinian to supporters of the arts. Why are we going to limit those who can actually get a degree? Because it can make it more challenging for some individuals to pursue artistic careers. But I argue in the book that these policies can also reduce the likelihood of individuals facing unnecessary financial, emotional, and social consequences from potentially misguided early career choices, and that can have large both individual and societal impacts. And I'm going to get into a little bit about my framework for policy that talks a little bit about the difference between policy aimed at society as opposed to policy aimed at individuals. Such measures can ultimately benefit the overall artistic workforce by ensuring that those who commit to an artistic career are better prepared and supported, and reduce the risk of adverse outcomes associated with the pursuit of an artistic profession. HEIs, though, can also do a lot. They can significantly contribute to aiding students in their career transitions, which may occur either during college or after graduation. I think we're so used to universities just sort of closing the door on graduates at the time of graduation and not having any sort of substantial or formidable relationship. But I argue in the book that students are constantly kind of going through this career transition process even after graduation, and perhaps it would be wise of HEIs to actually offer support services for graduates after the fact. Students also often reconsider their initial major choices, and HEI should definitely be offering good academic advising to assist. It should be a critical, I think, service at higher eds in the arts. And arts degree programs should also actively support students in preparing for career transitions, particularly if they choose to step away from artistic career paths. This might include integrating skills into curricula, which we've started to see, including professional and business development skills within arts programs, but also for students who choose to stay within artistic professions. HEIs should, as much as possible, provide opportunities such as embedding graduates within alumni networks or other professional associations to help with connections and opportunities. But lots of things I think the HEI can do in order to mitigate the issues of the benefit cost equation in the arts. I do argue, though, that no single policy or program will fully resolve these challenges, but a well-considered package of policies and programs thoroughly addressing these issues can actually significantly impact the costs and benefits of pursuing training in the early part of artistic careers. The strategy does not begin with the goal of eliminating individual risk. I think individual risk is essential for identifying talent and potential in the arts, but it starts with this comprehensive understanding of individual risk through an analysis of trends among artistic workers. The understanding then informs the consideration of broader economic and societal implications, leading to development of policies and programs that mitigate these societal risks stemming from individual choices. All right, so for the rest of the book, I conduct kind of similar analyses for the modes of artistic work and the places where artists work. And I don't have them in the slides, but I'm happy to share and talk a little bit more about them later, but I'm not going to go over them in the interest of time today. All right, so I'm going to move right on to the conclusion, skip a whole huge section of the book. But I propose, I hope, in the conclusion, what is a clear and compelling approach to designing effective policy for the artistic workforce. The policies recommended in the previous sections actually all align with the approach that I propose. And I'm going to present a few key principles that, if integrated into the design of policy for artists, can strengthen the artistic workforce. So this is hopefully a flexible framework that policymakers and the art sector can use to adapt to their own circumstances. I strongly believe that there is a disconnect between policy that influences and governs the artistic workforce and the unique dynamics of artistic work behavior, such that the level and quality of artistic production are suboptimal, and many individual artists today cannot sustain careers. So I argue with this new approach, we can actually start to close that gap. I think the reason for this disconnect or misalignment are pretty clear. Maybe they are because of the socially constructed perceptions of artists and the arts relative to other workers and industries. For example, many policymakers or arts sector leaders and advocates think about the scarcity mindset that's fed into this myth of the starving artist. And that colors our view of these workers as a population overwhelmed with precarity and without agency when it comes to building careers. And so, in other words, the arts sector subscribes to a model defined by artists and the arts not being able to cover the rising costs of doing business and thus requiring significant public subsidy. Other reasons, I think, are based on just a misunderstanding how policy can and should be designed to strengthen the overall functioning of a labor market. So one of the principles for designing effective artist policy, then, is to create policies addressing the societal effect of the accumulation of decisions by individuals, rather than policy aimed at addressing the specific conditions of individual artists in order to improve their lives. I talked about this a little bit earlier, but This is not to say that effective policy shouldn't consider the individual circumstances of the people they are meant to address or help make people better off. Hopefully they do, but only that there is a wide range of circumstances that no one policy will be able to address. Using policy to try to change the lives of individuals is potentially a waste of resources, since policy benefiting individuals does not always benefit a broader society. For example, policy around artists is often designed to address the financial precarity of these individuals, but there are actually many artists who are doing just fine because they're lucky, they're talented, they come from means, or a combination of all three of these things. So therefore, effective policy is such that the goal should be to affect broad societal change, with the secondary goal that these changes will benefit the individuals involved. Sometimes these approaches can work in tandem, hopefully that they do, that broad level policies impacting society can actually positively affect the individuals who are subject to them. But other times these types of broad policy initiatives may seem to be acting to the detriment of individuals, while at the same time strengthening the environment that the same individuals are striving to be a part of. And at other times, societal level policy decisions mean making hard choices about what to do for individuals, which can then have negative effects on society. The clearest example, I think, of this happening occurs when we choose to subsidize artists without realizing that this subsidization likely leads to more people wanting to work as artists and therefore lower wages and fewer job prospects for all. It's no doubt very challenging to design broad level policies that have clear goals for societal change, since with any policy, there are always unintended consequences. So the second fundamental principle I put forth for designing effective artist policy is to use evidence to inform policy design. So this might seem pretty common sense, but unfortunately, we have seen many sectors, including the arts and cultural sector, not make good use of research in both policy design and advocacy. And there are very few funding sources for research in the arts, as any researcher in this field knows. As my book makes clear, there is a plethora of past and ongoing research on the labor market conditions of artists from which policymakers can learn. In addition, there is research in other policy areas that can inform artist policy. We must also be careful about the quality and the type of research, though, that we use to make policy decisions. Research with predetermined outcomes, which the arts sector often uses in advocacy efforts, is not a good source of information if we are genuinely interested in good policy design. The arts and culture sector must be open to accepting that some of the most common value judgments about the arts are not necessarily grounded in reality or aligned with good policy. Therefore, the task for researchers is to abide by the principles of observational research and to clearly communicate the methods and findings to policymakers with the hope that they will listen. So that's my ideal world. All right, so my aim with this talk and the book, and I'll finish up in about 3 minutes, is to explore the disconnect between the motivations for and behaviors of engaging in artistic work with how public policy is designed for artists. I make the point that while the motivations and behaviors of workers largely drive how artists build careers, public policy rarely takes them into account. Alongside this new approach to designing policy for artist workers is the need to change the paradigm for how we currently think about and communicate the value of artists. Public policy for artists often aligns with contemporary narratives that highlight artists' instrumental contributions to society. Maybe these contributions are financial, such as when artists are credited with gentrifying rundown neighborhoods and stimulating regional economic development. But they also might be non-financial, for instance, when artists are relied on to translate the deeper meaning of contemporary events by making political statements or challenging widely held assumptions through their art. So much of public policy surrounding artists then involves subsidizing conditions in which artists are perceived to be valuable or contribute instrumentally. However, I argue that supporting artists through subsidies aimed at leveraging the perceived positive externalities or spillovers of artistic work presents many problems. In the book, I talk about a lot of these problems, but one of them, and perhaps the most significant, being the problem of instrumentalism. So in brief, instrumentalizing the arts involves viewing them as a tool for achieving measurable, primarily non-artistic outcomes, which can be both, again, financial and non-financial. Arts policy since at least the 1980s has relied heavily on instrumentalizing the arts, particularly through the practice of producing economic impact studies. An alternative view, I argue, on valuing artistic work focuses instead on the motivations and behaviors of workers. While the motivations and behaviors of workers largely drive occupational choice in the arts and many other occupations, public policy rarely takes them into account. So I believe that the key to designing effective policies that support the artistic workforce depends on reframing the perspective that artists should be valued based on their apparent instrumental benefits to society to one that values their choice to work. By doing so, I aim to establish artists as workers entitled to the same rights and privileges as other workers. In other words, artists are workers too. This reframing also challenges the common notion applied to artists, suggesting that those aspiring to be artists should choose more lucrative occupations to avoid the precarity associated with artistic careers. And I'll touch on that again in a bit. Most important, though, by making this argument, I aim to shift the narrative surrounding public policy, advocating for a focus on individual meaning making rather than solely on the instrumental benefits that workers provide to society. In the book, and I'm not going to go into it now, but in the book, I expand on all of this by arguing that the right to choose an occupation is a fundamental right for all individuals, akin to the freedom of expression and the right to have a family. These rights and liberties contribute to the advancement of individuals' highest order interests in society, including the pursuit of justice, the creation of a meaningful life, and access to the means necessary to achieve these objectives. This forms the basis for safeguarding the right to choose an occupation through institutional mechanisms such as public policy. So again, while the right to choose an occupation is a fundamental entitlement, I argue, for everyone, it does not actually absolve an individual from the responsibilities of ensuring their own welfare. The freedom to pursue a meaningful life is accompanied by the duty to adapt one's expectations in response to challenges encountered during this pursuit. This involves choosing an occupation that not only maximizes one's welfare, but also contributes to the greater good of society. Changing the perspective of how artists are valued, shifting from one based primarily on instrumental considerations to one that appreciates artists for their inherent right to choose an occupation, like any other worker, alleviates the pressure of proving that artists are exceptional and arguing that policy should treat them as such. This shift, I think, is beneficial given that public policy rewarding exceptionalism is rare and policies more often address the modal or the most common cases. All right, so the approach I take in this book is actually fairly optimistic. It's not apocalyptic like many of the nonfiction accounts we've read about artists. In that I actually hope to shift the dominant perspective that artists are just subject to the whims of the market and lack agency in their careers, to one that emphasizes a methodical approach to building a career in the arts and then designing policy to support the artistic workforce. This approach counters one that considers artists as either starving or privileged and instead presents artists as workers like any other. By learning about how artist workers navigate their complex labor markets, I not only show how artists can use labor markets to their advantage, but also that policy can support artists by aligning with the ways that they work. In other words, the gap between how artists work and the lack of effective policy that influences their career outcomes is a large part of the level of precarity we see within this occupation. I hope that with my set of principles that I can help guide the design of effective artist policy, and that we also start to see a more updated and relevant framework for policy to be developed for supporting the artistic workforce. While these principles actually came out of my work studying the artistic population and current landscape of artist policy, these principles could actually be applied to any areas of public policy. So the larger lesson I think we get from this book is that policy to support artists should be based on the fundamental principles for how to design good policy for any sort of problem. We have a tendency, I think, when approached with a problem, to always try to develop a new, never heard before solution. But in doing this, we forget that many of our problems we deal with are problems of a specific sort. And if we just look hard enough, we can find a solution that's been used in a different context. I'm not saying that we should just sort of copy and paste, not at all. But I'm saying that we should use elements of old policies that have already been tested and then start to create new with them. So good, effective policy design is like any other type of innovation, which depends on the process of creative destruction. So we have new processes, new products, and then they're created using parts of the old, in effect, making the old obsolete. New policies, again, are just not simply a result of reconfiguring the old. They're versions of the olds that are adapted. So the more effective the tailoring, though, the better the policy. And that's really the hard part about designing good policy. It's tailoring these policies to the context we have, which is hopefully what the book provides. So I'm also going to say good effective policy requires focusing on the long game. A big part of the reason that artist policy is so fragmented and underdeveloped is that there's never been a consistent long-term effort by policymakers and advocates to create a system that can realistically support the artistic workforce, or a consistent set of evidence that can help support this system. We have seen kind of boosts of efforts here and there, and the book gets into some of those efforts, but nothing that has maintained the longevity needed for systemic change. Now that this book exists, hopefully there is no excuse not to support the artistic workforce if we believe that there is value in enabling individuals to choose to be an artist at work. Thank you so much. That's the end of the talk. And I have 20 minutes for conversation and questions, so I'm happy to converse. Thank you again.
Thank you, Joanna. Wonderful. So now's the time where people get to raise their hand, ask some questions. We've got a big group. Looks like Sunil already put something in the chat, which I haven't. I'll try to process real quick now. So we're going non-instrumental benefits of artists. In that case, are there unique motivational, choice-based factors we should be tracking for artists? Or should we be looking rather at career motivations and choices affecting all workers?
So, I mean, I think in the book I argue, and I think in general, I argue that these types of outcomes that are kind of removed from the occupation in of itself are the problematic types of goals to focus on when designing policy. So I think that includes both financial and non-financial. The whole paradigm shift that I'm arguing for here is that we're actually looking at the choices of individuals and how they choose to pursue a particular occupation, which can apply then to every occupation. I think, is that addressing the question?
Yes, thank you. That was my question. In fact, about the choice, about whether you're kind of asking that, there's nothing specific there we need to tease out about artists' trajectories. I mean, there is, but not necessarily to inform policy for all workers.
But I think your question is a good one because it's funny. The book actually argues that there are lots of specificities about how artists work that we need to be attuned to in order to understand how to design policy. But at the same time, it concludes on this point that says there's nothing specific about artists that we should consider them exceptional and design policy around them, right? So it's a little bit like you might look at that as maybe arguing the opposite. But I think what I'm saying there is that really you think about the labor market behavior of any occupation and understanding how best to support and stimulate and incentivize labor market behavior for any occupation. So sort of artists should be lumped into that category of any occupation and understanding how to support, if that makes sense.
Not seeing any other hands up, I'm going to take a prerogative and ask you, Joanna, about maybe not a contradiction, but where you see the boundaries on this. And the boundary question is, as you're defining artists here, it's about occupation. It's about working for pay as an artist. And, I'm also interested in all those artists who do artsy things without having an occupation as an artist. But you also have, in one of your latter slides, that we shouldn't be instrumentalizing this stuff. And, it shouldn't be about its economic or social utility is why we do this, except you're defining artists by occupation, work choice, which seems hard to say this is not relevant to economic utility, that it may not be instrumental, but that might actually be fundamental in that definition of artists. So the question with this rambling of mine out of the way is, where do you see the boundaries beyond the art worker as an occupation about other artists, and what's the limitation of thinking about the economics of artists based on your sort of definition?
Yeah. So first off, the occupational classification actually uses the majority of time spent right, as the way to define, and you know this, now that obviously correlates with income in the arts and income in a particular occupation. But that being said, it doesn't actually start off with the sort of economic output of an artist. So I would say that's one sort of weak argument, right, to the contradiction. The other argument to the contradiction, though, is sorry, I'm blanking right now. But the other argument to the contradiction, can you repeat your question? Oh, yeah, sorry. That it goes into the, and I didn't discuss this in the talk, but it goes, and I discuss it in the book, but that goes into the very definition of the artist. So that's the biggest debate, right? With anyone looking at these data and saying, well, it's a really small, right, portion of the artistic workforce that you're looking at. And it doesn't apply to so many people who don't, for example, spend the majority of their time on art or earn the most income. But I think what I argue is that there are certain lessons that you learn from the data that you use, and the lessons are sort of linked to the data that you use. So I'm using data on occupations in order to understand the work and career behavior of the artistic workforce. Now, I'm only getting a sample of individuals who actually claim that they are workers in the arts, but I make the argument that that should not negate that this is also how other artists not showing up in the data build their careers. And so I think what we've gotten the trouble that we've gotten into in using data to support artist policy is that, well, we can't trust the census data. It only shows us a small snippet of people who are working in the arts. And I don't think it's true. What we actually see is really good evidence on how careers are built. And maybe those people who are outside of the workforce actually just haven't entered that little sample yet. And so we don't see them, but it doesn't mean to say that the trends and the statistics that we're seeing and the evidence is not actually applying to them. So I think that evidence can actually be far more useful than we give credit to in thinking about policy for artists. So I think that probably gets a little bit to your question, which is not all of this only applies to the people making money, making art. It's people who are outside of the sample as well.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Super answer. Michael.
All right. Thank you, Joanna. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Michael.
Okay. I guess I'll start with just so that we're clear here. I think you're actually, in terms of arts policy, I think what you're proposing in this book is something actually really radical. Because traditionally, if you think back, I started doing cultural economics about 30 years ago. And you start teaching the introductory courses on why are there public subsidies for the arts? And it's all about externalities and public goods, right? And you're saying, market forces on their own will underproduce the arts because there are these external benefits. They're not necessarily instrumental. The benefits can be just intrinsic in the art itself. This is valuable to develop our culture purely for its own sake. But that's the way we traditionally thought about, here's your market failure. And this is why we have a class on arts policy at all, because we're trying to fix what we see as a market failure. But you come at it from actually a completely different angle. And you're saying, actually, I'm going to put that policy idea aside, because the real policy issue is in artists themselves and how they are trained and how we think about building their human capital. And of course, we have all kinds of policies in the world for developing human capital, right? Education policies, subsidies of technical colleges and apprenticeships, even trying to give incentives for people to go into certain careers. So for example, in Indiana, for example, you'll get a break on tuition if you get an education degree, as long as you promise to teach for 5 years in the state. They will do that. And, so you're trying to, a specialized policy trying to increase the supply because it's a teacher shortage. But your focus is essentially saying, here is actually your real arts policy issue. It's about how we finance the development of artists. That's the, I used to have a boss who always asked about any policy issue, what's the problem you're trying to solve? And you've chosen this as the problem in arts policy that actually is the one that needs solving. is how do people become artists? And we have all these different human capital policies out there because there are a lot of market failures just in getting any kind of degree because of imperfect capital markets and such. But you're saying, but artists face special ones. And so we have to look at those as special things. We're not treating artists as different from somebody who wants to be a nurse or a teacher or a lawyer or whatever, but we are saying there are market conditions that they are dealing with that aren't the same as these other professions, and we ought to have policies there. This sounds like a long comment, but I actually do have a question. Have I got this right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
That's great. Actually, thanks, Michael. And I really appreciate that framing that Joanna, despite her, I think, fairly soft-spoken presentation on this, only one mention of Yoko Ono. Like, this is actually kind of radical stuff. That this should pop more in people's eyes than it might let on. So thanks, Michael. Amy.
Yeah, just building on all of that, Joanna, and I would say this to Yoko Ono too. Biggest congratulations, really sincere congratulations on this amazing piece of work. There's so many things that I could bring to mind. I'll just gonna lower my hand. Like the move beyond instrumentalization and also the move beyond some of the books in the field that I admire, but like, you know, for example, Bill Drezowitz's book is like a perfect description of what's wrong, but I really appreciate the way you're going into detail with data, placing artists in a broader context, and then thinking about principles of policy construction. And I just really want to pause for a moment and celebrate that. I have emailed our librarian, and I imagine I will want my own reference copy of the book on my desk too. So yeah, huge brava, well done. The question I have is about the definition of the artist as a worker. One of the things that comes up a lot in some of the research, I know you know I do, some of the papers with Roman, like on Frank Stella or on fractional equity, is the peculiar character of artists as laborers, where they are not only producers, but also investors. And they're making things where the value changes substantially over time. I don't think they're the only workers who are in that situation. Early stage entrepreneurs are in that situation, writers, scientists, a lot of other people. But you know, however we frame that within the economic theory that I think Doug was bringing up about utility, like I think of it more as about motivation toward superstar status, you know, for professors, for artists, for anyone else. But I just wondered if you could like share a little bit more about the definition of the artist as a laborer with regard to a question of what's production and what's investment.
Yeah, so I think you touched on it kind of spot on there, that it's not right. The blurriness between production and investment is obviously not just specific to artists, right? Like I think about this every day. I'm technically on a leave of absence, and I am not on a leave of absence, right? Because if I take a step back from my work right now, investing in it, then when I come back from my leave of absence, I will have, in my mind, lost that much more productivity, right? So I think the way I think about it is the blurriness is there, but it's more along, I think it's kind of a mistake to make such a stark distinction between investment and production, because ultimately production is linked to investment. You can't have the production without the investment. And you could argue that even for the workers that we don't see typically these maybe explicit, right, investment periods. So, you know, who's to say that a construction worker is not investing in producing what they do ultimately in their, you know, in constructing a home while they're not in the process of constructing a home. I mean, I just think the distinction has actually made it it has put up barriers to how we think about artists as workers. It might be that distinction, when it's so stark, has actually placed artists in this non-worker category, you could argue, which is why we don't actually have good labor force policy helping support artistic careers. So if I want to choose to be an artist, everybody thinks, well, you're going to just go and do something for fun, right? I'm just going to go invest in my own well-being. Well, that's a common misconception, right? And a perception that I think is like a stereotype that's put out there through all of these different modes and mechanisms that I talked about in the book, but it doesn't do anything that's beneficial in my opinion, for actually helping the individual choose artistic work as a career. So I think many of the policy sort of approaches and challenges that we have identified for artist work has actually backfired on the ability of actually designing good labor force policy for artists. I think that gets a little bit to your question. We could have a whole conversation about it, though.
And you should.
Yeah.
All right, looking at the time, I'm going to go what might be the last question, but I'm going to pick on Ellen here because I really like this question. And partly I think because it picks up on a theme. This is not just a book about the artistic workforce. This is really about policy and trying to shape, inform, inspire policy. And that's where Ellen's question in the chat is, I think, got some really interesting practical political aspects to it. So in the time until everyone becomes true believers in your book, Joanna, do you have suggestions on how we might implement your insights when we're asked for advice or have the opportunity to exert any influence in the policy space, especially in light of quite a few governments and politicians are kind of right-leaning right now? You know, how do we replace the instrumentalist discourse, which is pretty easy for them to digest?
Yeah, I really think what I write, like if there's one chapter you read in the book, read the conclusion, because I think it gets to the heart of that question. Also read the foreword, because I thank all of the people who helped me with this book, which were a lot of people, by the way. And please do, I have to acknowledge that you sit behind your computer and you write a book, but you have all these conversations with people in your life that ultimately end up in what you write. And so, I mean, constant conversations with Doug and Michael and Carol Rosenstein and my husband, my poor husband. I mean, all these people are just pivotal in being able to write this thing. And I wrote this thing through the pandemic with 3 kids under 5, and it was quite a feat. So, well, part of it at least. I did not get it done during that. So anyway, going back to your question though, Ellen, yeah, if there's one chapter that answers that, it's the final chapter. And I think what I really argue in that chapter, like without even saying it, is we want to go back to basics of good policy design. I think so often we're asked questions about what do we do for this problem? Artists are, it's a really hard career to make a living in, et cetera. And we try to come up with all of these new ways to try to approach these problems. And I'm not saying like go and recreate the, Federal Theater Project, or, I'm not saying go back to the time of the Great Depression and think about what they did then, because it's not the Great Depression. And Michael and I have had lots of conversations about that. But I'm saying that we actually probably know really good strategic answers to many of the challenges that we already face. And if you just look around, there are many policies that are already implemented, that labor force, workforce policies that probably adapt really well in our cases, in this case, in the artist case as well. So I would say if you're in a situation where you are thinking about policy design, thinking about the challenges facing artistic work or artist policy, really that's where you go back to the basics and you find the evidence that says this has already been done before, and now let's adapt it to our context. So it doesn't have to be Nobel Prize winning. It really is already there. And I think we forget that. We go into these rooms, we try to be novel and we come up with all these new, ways to try to do things, but ultimately I think the answers are sometimes right in front of us. So I don't know, that would be what I think the final chapter says, without saying it, of course. I had to look like I was saying something new, but I'm probably not in that chapter. So
That's all right. Well, given the things that are right in front of us, hopefully you all can get a Amazon window open right in front of you and order the book now to get all you'd ever want to know about the rest of this and more. Thank you, Joanna. I see we're at time. I'm going to make sure to show you Kelsey's great comment that we didn't get a chance to. It's long, but it's wonderful. And everyone else, thank you for attending. And Becca posted into the chat our upcoming schedule. We're going to be back here a week from today at noon for a talk by David Maggs, and you can see the rest of the schedule for the rest of the semester. So I hope you all keep coming back.
yeah, thank you all. So nice to see everybody, and I can't wait to see you all through our rest of our series this semester, which is going to be a really cool series of interesting talks about policy. So come and join us. All right, bye.
Everyone, bye.